Captain James Morrison had served the royal family for 15 years, and every morning began the same way. He would stand at attention outside the nursery wing of Kensington Palace, his polished boots reflecting the early sunlight that streamed through the tall windows. His uniform was immaculate, his posture perfect, and his dedication unwavering. But today felt different somehow, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. Prince George, now 8 years old, had always been a curious child. Unlike the formal portraits that graced the palace walls, the real George was full of questions, energy, and an innocent wisdom that often caught the adults around him off guard. James had watched him grow from a toddling prince who would peek around corners to catch glimpses of the guards, to a thoughtful boy who seemed to understand far more about the world than most children his age. The morning routine was well established. James would escort Prince George from his private quarters to the breakfast room, maintaining the proper distance while ensuring the young prince's safety. They rarely spoke during these walks as protocol demanded, but James had noticed how George's eyes would dart around, taking in everything with an almost scientific curiosity. As they walked through the long corridor lined with paintings of past monarchs, Prince George suddenly stopped. He turned to look at James with those serious blue eyes that reminded everyone of his great-grandmother, the late Queen Elizabeth. There was something different in his expression today, something that made James's chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't name. "Captain Morrison," George said quietly, his voice carrying a maturity that seemed far beyond his years. "Do you ever wonder what it would be like to choose your own path in life?" The question hung in the air between them like a delicate spider's web. James felt his breath catch in his throat. In all his years of service, no member of the royal family had ever asked him such a personal question. Protocol dictated that he should give a respectful but distant response, something about duty and service to the crown. But looking into those earnest young eyes, James found himself speaking from the heart instead. "Every day, Your Royal Highness," he admitted softly. "Every single day." George nodded slowly, as if this answer confirmed something he had been thinking about for a long time. He resumed walking, but his pace was slower now, more thoughtful. James matched his stride, his mind racing with questions about why this conversation felt so significant. When they reached the breakfast room, George paused at the doorway. "Captain Morrison?" he said again, turning back to face the guard who had become such a constant presence in his young life. "I think people should be free to make their own choices, don't you? Even if those choices are difficult for others to understand?" Before James could respond, Prince George disappeared into the breakfast room, leaving the captain standing alone in the hallway with his thoughts spinning. That simple exchange had somehow shifted something fundamental in James's world, though he wouldn't fully understand what until much later. The rest of the day passed in a blur of routine duties, but James couldn't shake the feeling that Prince George's words carried a weight far beyond their surface meaning. There was something in the boy's tone, something in the way he had looked at James that suggested this conversation was far from over. As evening fell and James prepared to end his shift, he found himself wondering if tomorrow would bring more of these unexpected moments of connection, and whether he was prepared for wherever they might lead. 3 weeks had passed since that first unexpected conversation, and James noticed that Prince George had begun to change in subtle ways. The boy still maintained his royal composure during official functions and public appearances, but during their private moments in the corridors, he had started asking more questions. Not about royal protocol or his studies, but about life beyond the palace walls. "Captain Morrison," George had said just yesterday while they waited for his tutor to arrive, "tell me about your family. Do you have children?" James had hesitated, knowing that personal conversations between staff and royals were generally discouraged. But there was something so genuine in George's curiosity that he found himself sharing small details about his daughter Emma, who was the same age as the prince and attended a regular school in London. "Does she get to choose what she wants to be when she grows up?" George had asked, and the innocence of the question had nearly broken James's heart. "Yes, Your Royal Highness," James had replied carefully. "She talks about becoming a veterinarian or maybe an artist. She changes her mind every few weeks, and that's perfectly normal for children her age." George had nodded thoughtfully but said nothing more. However, James could see the wheels turning in the young prince's mind, processing this information about a world where children could dream freely about their futures. Today brought a new development that caught James completely off guard. As they walked through the palace gardens during George's afternoon break, the prince suddenly stopped near the rose garden where his great-grandmother used to spend quiet moments. He picked up a small stone from the path and turned it over in his hands, examining it as if it held some secret. "I've been thinking about what you said," George began, his voice so quiet that James had to lean closer to hear him. "About choosing your own path. I've been watching people, you know. The gardeners, the kitchen staff, even you. Everyone seems to have something they do because they want to, not just because they have to." James felt a chill run down his spine. He sensed that this conversation was heading into dangerous territory. But he also knew that Prince George needed someone to listen to him. Really listen. Perhaps for the first time in his young life. "Your Royal Highness," James said carefully, "everyone has duties and responsibilities, regardless of their station in life. But there's a difference, isn't there?" George looked up at him with those penetrating blue eyes. "Between choosing to do something because you believe in it, and doing something because you were born into it with no choice at all." The wisdom in those words, coming from an 8-year-old boy, left James speechless. He realized that Prince George wasn't just asking philosophical questions out of curiosity. He was grappling with the weight of his destiny in ways that no child should have to. "I dream sometimes," George continued, throwing the small stone into a nearby fountain. "I dream about being just George. Not Prince George, not the future king, just a regular boy who could decide for himself what he wanted to do with his life." James watched the ripples spread across the fountain's surface, knowing that this moment would stay with him forever. He wanted to tell the prince that dreams were important, that every child deserved the right to imagine different futures for themselves. But he also knew the reality of their situation, the impossibility of what George was describing. "Dreams are powerful things, Your Royal Highness," he said finally. "Sometimes they show us what we truly value, even if we can't always make them reality." George smiled then, a sad but knowing smile that made him look far older than his years. "Thank you for not telling me I'm being silly," he said. "Everyone else would." As they walked back toward the palace, James realized that something fundamental had shifted between them. Prince George wasn't just confiding in him anymore. He was trusting him with thoughts and feelings that could never be shared with anyone else in his world. The weight of that trust was both an honor and a burden that James wasn't sure he was prepared to carry. The breakthrough moment came on a rainy Thursday afternoon in November. Prince George had been unusually quiet during his morning lessons, and his tutors had mentioned to James that the boy seemed distracted and melancholy. When James arrived to escort him to lunch, he found George sitting by his bedroom window, watching the raindrops race down the glass. "They're planning my entire life," George said without turning around. "I heard them talking this morning. Father and his advisors. They have schedules mapped out until I'm 30 years old. Universities, military service, official duties, even suggestions for suitable friendships and future marriage considerations." James felt his heart sink. He had known this day would come, when the reality of George's predetermined future would become impossible to ignore. But hearing it described so clinically, as if the prince were a chess piece to be moved around a board rather than a living, breathing child with his own hopes and dreams, made James's stomach churn. "I understand this must be overwhelming, Your Royal Highness," James said gently, moving to stand beside the window. George finally turned to face him, and James was shocked to see tears glistening in the young prince's eyes. "Do you know what the worst part is, Captain Morrison? It's not that I have no choice. It's that everyone expects me to be grateful for having no choice. They expect me to smile and nod and say how honored I am to serve, when the truth is, I just want to be a normal boy who can make mistakes and learn from them and choose his own adventures." The raw honesty in those words hit James like a physical blow. He had spent 15 years protecting members of the royal family from physical harm, but he was powerless to protect this child from the emotional weight of his destiny. The helplessness he felt in that moment was overwhelming. "I've been thinking about something," George continued, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "Something that might sound crazy, but I need to tell someone, and you're the only person who really listens to me." James knelt down so he could look George directly in the eyes. "You can tell me anything, Your Royal Highness. I promise you that. What if I could make a choice? Just one real choice that was entirely my own?" George's voice was gaining strength as he spoke. "Not about what I'll study or where I'll go to university or who I'll marry someday, but about who stands beside me. about who I trust to protect me and understand me. James felt a strange tremor in his chest, as if something important was about to shift in their relationship. What do you mean? I mean you, Captain Morrison. Everyone else in my life was chosen for me by committees and advisors and people who think they know what's best for a prince. But if I could choose just one person to be on my side, someone who sees me as George first and a prince second, it would be you. The sincerity in George's voice was heartbreaking. James realized that this 8-year-old boy was offering him the greatest compliment of his career, perhaps of his entire life. But he also understood that there was something deeper happening here, something that went beyond a simple expression of trust and affection. You honor me with your trust, Your Royal Highness, James said carefully, but I'm not sure I understand what you're asking of me. George stood up straighter, and for a moment James could see the future king that everyone expected him to become. But then the boy's expression softened and he was just George again. I'm asking you to let me choose you, Captain Morrison, to make this one decision for myself, even if it's the only one I ever get to make. James felt tears prick at his own eyes as he began to understand what Prince George was really saying. This wasn't just about their friendship or their professional relationship. This was about a young boy trying to assert some small measure of control over his own life, to make one authentic choice in a world where everything else was decided for him. I would be honored to serve you in whatever way you choose. Your Royal Highness, James said, his voice thick with emotion. Always. George smiled then, the first genuine smile James had seen from him in weeks. But there was something else in that smile, something that suggested this conversation was far from over, and that the choice George wanted to make was bigger and more significant than either of them yet fully understood. The plan began to take shape over the following weeks, though James didn't immediately recognize it as a plan. Prince George had started making small requests that seemed innocent enough on the surface. He asked if they could take longer routes to his appointments, walking through parts of the palace that were less frequented by staff and other royals. He began asking James to stay nearby during his private study time, claiming that he felt more focused with the captain's reassuring presence in the room. Most significantly, George had started asking detailed questions about James's life outside the palace. He wanted to know about James's childhood, his decision to join the military, his path to becoming a royal protection officer. But he was particularly interested in the moments when James had made choices that went against expectations or conventional wisdom. Tell me again about when you left university to join the army, George said one afternoon as they sat in the palace library. Your parents weren't happy about that decision, were they? No, Your Royal Highness, they weren't, James replied honestly. They had hoped I would become a lawyer or perhaps follow my father into banking. But I felt called to serve my country in a different way. And you don't regret it? George asked, his eyes bright with curiosity. Even though it meant disappointing people you loved? James considered the question carefully. There were difficult moments, he admitted. Times when I wondered if I had made the right choice. But ultimately, I've never regretted following my own path, even when it was harder than the alternative. George nodded solemnly, as if filing this information away for future reference. Do you think there's ever a time when it's right to choose your own path, even if it means letting other people down? The question sent a chill through James, though he couldn't quite articulate why. There was something in George's tone, something in the way he was building toward a larger point that made James uneasy. But he answered honestly, as he always did. I think we all have to live with our own consciences, Your Royal Highness. Sometimes doing what's right for ourselves is the only way we can truly serve others in the long run. Even if it means changing everything, George pressed. Even if it means admitting that the life everyone expects you to live isn't the life you're meant to live? James felt his heart rate quicken. Your Royal Highness, these are very complex questions for someone your age to be grappling with. But I am grappling with them, George said firmly. And I need to know that at least one person in my life will support me when I make my choice, even if everyone else thinks I'm making a mistake. The weight of what George was asking began to settle on James's shoulders like a heavy cloak. He realized that these conversations hadn't been philosophical exercises or childhood curiosity. Prince George was preparing for something, working up the courage to make a decision that would change everything. What kind of choice are you considering, Your Royal Highness? James asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. George was quiet for a long moment, staring out the library window at the London skyline beyond the palace grounds. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I've been thinking about what would happen if I said no. No to what?" "To all of it. To the crown, to the expectations, to the life everyone has planned for me." George turned to face James, and the captain was struck by how much older the boy looked than he had just a few months ago. "I know it sounds impossible, and I know it would hurt a lot of people. But what if I just said no? What if I chose to be George instead of Prince George?" James felt the room spinning around him. This wasn't just a child's fantasy about escaping responsibility. Prince George was seriously considering stepping away from his royal destiny, and he was looking to James for support and validation. That would be an enormous decision. "Your Royal Highness," James said carefully, "one with consequences that would reach far beyond your own life." "I know," George replied, "but it would also be my decision. The first real choice I would ever make for myself. And if I'm going to make it, I need to know that someone believes in me enough to stand by me, even if the whole world thinks I'm wrong." James looked into those serious blue eyes and saw not just a confused child, but a young person struggling with questions of identity, purpose, and personal freedom that most people never had to face. The magnitude of what George was considering was staggering, but so was the courage it would take to even contemplate such a choice. "Whatever you decide, Your Royal Highness," James heard himself saying, "you have my support and my loyalty, always." George smiled then, and James realized that without meaning to, he had just committed himself to supporting what might be the most controversial decision in modern royal history. The moment of truth came on a crisp December morning, exactly 1 week before Prince George's 9th birthday. James had arrived at the palace early, as was his custom, but something felt different in the air. There was an unusual tension among the staff, whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when he passed, and an overall sense that something significant was about to happen. When James knocked on Prince George's door to begin their morning routine, he was surprised to find the boy already dressed and sitting calmly at his desk, writing in what appeared to be a journal. George looked up with a serene expression that James had never seen before, as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "Good morning, Captain Morrison," George said with unusual formality. "I'm glad you're here. I have something very important to discuss with you." James stepped into the room, immediately noticing that it looked different somehow. Many of George's personal belongings had been carefully arranged and organized, as if he were preparing for a journey. The sight made James's stomach clench with apprehension. "I've made my decision," George announced without preamble. "I've spent months thinking about it, weighing all the consequences, considering how it will affect everyone around me. But I've finally reached a conclusion that I can live with." James sat down in the chair across from George's desk, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "What have you decided, Your Royal Highness?" George closed his journal and looked directly at James. "I'm going to abdicate my claim to the throne. Not now, obviously, but I'm going to make it clear that when the time comes for me to assume royal duties, I will respectfully decline. I want to live as a private citizen, to make my own choices about my education, my career, and my life." The words hung in the air like a bombshell. James felt as though all the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. He had known this conversation was coming, had sensed George building toward this decision for weeks, but hearing it stated so clearly and definitively still shocked him to his core. "Your Royal Highness," James began, struggling to find the right words. "This is an enormous decision with implications that reach far beyond your own life. Have you discussed this with your father? With your grandmother?" George shook his head. "Not yet, but I'm going to tell them today. I've written letters to everyone who needs to know, explaining my reasoning and asking for their understanding. I know they'll be disappointed, probably angry, and certainly confused. But I also know that this is the right choice for me." James studied the young prince's face, looking for any sign of doubt or uncertainty, but George's expression remained calm and resolute, as if he had found a peace that had been eluding him for months. "Why are you telling me first?" James asked. George smiled, and for the first time in weeks it was the genuine, joyful smile of a child. "Because you're the person who helped me understand that I had a choice in the first place. You listened to me when no one else would, and you treated me like a person instead of just a future king. I wanted you to know that your support gave me the courage to be honest about who I really am and what I really want." James felt tears welling up in his eyes. I'm honored by your trust, Your Royal Highness. But I have to ask, are you absolutely certain about this decision? Once you make it public, there will be no going back. I'm certain, George replied without hesitation. For the first time in my life, I'm completely certain about something. I know it will be difficult and I know it will change everything. But I also know that I can't live someone else's life just because it's expected of me. James nodded slowly, beginning to understand the full magnitude of what was about to unfold. What do you need from me, Your Royal Highness? George stood up and walked around his desk to face James directly. I need you to stand by me when everyone else thinks I've lost my mind. I need you to believe in my choice even when the consequences become clear. And most importantly, I need you to help me transition into whatever comes next. James rose to his feet and looked down at this remarkable young person who had somehow found the courage to choose authenticity over expectation, personal truth over public duty. You have my complete support, Your Royal Highness. Whatever happens next, we'll face it together. George reached out and shook James's hand, a gesture that felt both formal and deeply personal. Thank you, Captain Morrison. Now let's go tell my father that his son has chosen to be George instead of Prince George. As they walked toward the door, James realized that everything was about to change, not just for Prince George, but for everyone whose lives intersected with the royal family. The boy's quiet but powerful choice would send shockwaves through the monarchy, the country, and the world. But looking at George's determined expression, James also knew that some choices were worth making regardless of their consequences. The reaction was swift and devastating. Within hours of Prince George's announcement to his father, Kensington Palace had become a whirlwind of emergency meetings, frantic phone calls, and barely controlled panic. James watched from the sidelines as constitutional experts, royal advisors, and senior members of the royal household scrambled to understand the implications of what an 8-year-old boy had just declared. Prince William's initial response had been a mixture of shock, disbelief, and paternal concern. James had been present during the private meeting, standing at attention while father and son faced each other across an enormous gulf of expectation and reality. The Prince of Wales had tried reasoning, then pleading, then gentle scolding, but George had remained calm and resolute throughout the entire conversation. This isn't a game. George, his father had said, his voice strained with emotion. This is our family's legacy, our duty to the nation, our responsibility to something much larger than ourselves. I understand that, Father, George had replied, with heartbreaking maturity. But it's also my life, and I need to live it as myself, not as someone everyone else wants me to be. By evening, word had begun to leak beyond the palace walls. James could see the security team scrambling to manage what was clearly going to become a media crisis of unprecedented proportions. But his primary concern remained with George, who had spent the day meeting with various family members and advisors, explaining his position with a patience and clarity that amazed everyone who spoke with him. The most difficult conversation had been with the king himself. Charles had listened to his grandson with a mixture of sadness and admiration, recognizing perhaps something of his own younger self in George's struggle with duty versus personal fulfillment. But the institutional weight of the monarchy was not something that could be easily set aside, regardless of individual wishes. You're asking us to fundamentally alter centuries of tradition, the king had told George gently. The implications extend far beyond our family. There are constitutional considerations, questions of succession, impacts on the Commonwealth realms. I know, grandfather, George had replied, and I'm sorry for the complications my choice will create, but I can't live my entire life as an apology for who I really am. As the day wore on, James began to understand that his own position was becoming increasingly untenable. Several senior palace officials had already questioned his role in George's decision, suggesting that his influence had been inappropriate and potentially damaging. The implication was clear. If Prince George was determined to step away from royal life, perhaps his chosen protector should step away as well. The moment of truth came late that evening when James was summoned to meet with the palace's head of security. Sir Robert Ashworth was a career military man who had served the royal family for over 2 decades, and his expression was grave as James entered his office. Captain Morrison, Sir Robert began without preamble, we need to discuss your future role here at the palace. James had been expecting this conversation all day. I understand, sir. Do you? Sir Robert leaned back in his chair, studying James carefully. Because what's happened today isn't just about Prince George making an unusual choice. It's about the relationship between a royal protection officer and his charge crossing lines that should never be crossed. With respect, sir, James replied. I never encouraged Prince George to make this decision. I simply listened to him and provided emotional support during a difficult time. And in doing so, you may have enabled one of the most disruptive events in modern royal history, Sir Robert said bluntly. There are those who believe your influence was instrumental in bringing about this crisis. James felt a flash of anger, but he kept his voice steady. Prince George made this choice because he's a thoughtful, intelligent young person who was struggling with questions about his identity and his future. He would have reached this conclusion with or without my support. Sir Robert was quiet for a long moment, then sighed deeply. Perhaps that's true. But the reality is that your position here has become untenable. Too many people see you as part of the problem rather than part of the solution. James nodded slowly, understanding what was being asked of him. You want my resignation? I want what's best for everyone involved, Sir Robert replied. Including you, Captain Morrison. This situation is going to generate enormous controversy and media attention. Your association with Prince George's decision will make you a target for criticism and speculation. James thought about George, probably lying awake in his room at that very moment, wondering if the one adult who had truly supported him was about to abandon him as well. The thought was unbearable. But James also understood the impossible position he was being placed in. When would you need my resignation to take effect? He asked quietly. Immediately, Sir Robert said. I'm sorry, James, I know this isn't easy. But there's really no other choice. As James walked back through the palace corridors one last time, he realized that Prince George's powerful choice had created a ripple effect that was already changing lives in ways none of them had fully anticipated. The boy who had wanted to make just one authentic decision for himself had inadvertently forced everyone around him to examine their own choices and loyalties. James stood outside Prince George's door one final time, his resignation letter tucked inside his uniform jacket. It was just past midnight, and the palace had finally quieted after the most tumultuous day in recent royal history. He knew he shouldn't be here. That protocol demanded he leave without saying goodbye, but he couldn't bring himself to abandon the brave young boy who had trusted him with his deepest thoughts and fears. He knocked softly, and George's voice immediately called out for him to enter. The prince was sitting by his window, still fully dressed, clearly having been unable to sleep. When he saw James, his face lit up with relief. I was hoping you would come, George said. I heard the whispers today. They're blaming you for my decision, aren't they? James nodded, sitting down in the chair across from George one last time. Your Royal Highness, I need you to understand something very important. Your choice today was entirely your own. You didn't need my influence or anyone else's to know what was right for you. You have wisdom and courage that most adults never develop. George's eyes filled with tears. But they're making you leave because of me, aren't they? They think you made me want to give up the crown. No one made you do anything, James said firmly. You made a choice about how you want to live your life, and that choice came from your own heart and mind. I'm proud to have known you during this important time, and I'm honored that you trusted me enough to share your thoughts with me. George wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, trying to maintain his composure. What will happen to you now? James smiled, pulling out his resignation letter and placing it on the small table between them. I'm going to make my own choice just like you did. I'm going to step down from my position here and find a new path for myself. Because of me? George asked, his voice breaking. Because of us, James corrected. Because sometimes when one person has the courage to make an authentic choice, it inspires others to examine their own lives and consider new possibilities. George stood up and walked to his window, looking out at the London lights twinkling in the distance. Do you think I'm doing the right thing, even if it hurts people I love? James joined him at the window, seeing the city from the perspective of someone who was about to leave palace life behind forever. I think you're doing the brave thing, Your Royal Highness. And sometimes being brave means accepting that we can't make everyone happy, even people we care about deeply. Will you stay in touch? George asked quietly. After everything changes and I'm not Prince George anymore, will you still be my friend? James felt his throat tighten with emotion. If you want me to be, then yes. Nothing would make me happier than to remain your friend. George. They stood together in comfortable silence for several minutes, both understanding that this was a goodbye that would mark the end of one chapter and the beginning of something entirely new for both of them. Thank you, George said finally, turning to face James with those serious blue eyes that had seen too much responsibility for someone so young. Thank you for listening to me, for believing in me, and for helping me understand that I have the right to choose my own path. James shook the boy's hand one last time, marveling at the strength in those small fingers. Thank you for teaching me that real courage sometimes means disappointing people in order to be true to yourself. 6 months later, James received a letter at his new job as a security consultant for a private firm. The envelope was addressed simply to Captain Morrison, in handwriting he recognized immediately. Inside was a photograph of a smiling boy in regular clothes, standing outside a normal school with a backpack slung over his shoulder. On the back, someone had written, "Just George now. Happy and free. Thank you for helping me find my way." James pinned the photograph to his office wall, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful choices are the quiet ones made by ordinary people who decide to live authentically, regardless of expectations. Prince George's silent but powerful decision had changed the course of royal history, but more importantly, it had given a young boy the chance to discover who he truly was beneath the weight of a crown he never wanted to wear. The story made headlines around the world, but for James it would always be remembered as the time he witnessed real courage in its purest form, and learned that sometimes stepping away from everything you've ever known is the only way to step into who you're meant to become.